We are back, and we are joined now by my friend Jeff Stein of the Washington Post, whose series in the Washington Post, the White House economics reporter for them, is entitled "The Money War," examining the impact of U.S. sanctions on the rest of the world. Jeff, I wish we could sanction the New York Rangers. How are you doing today?
I mean, nothing seems to be working, so
uh, Je-
permanent financial exclusion for Chris Jury.
That would
For
be nice. For Jeff and I are big New York Rangers fans. We have our, I don't know, you're a part of that small little community on Twitter where we talk about them. But yeah,
yeah,
going
the
from,
overlap between newspaper dorks and Rangers fans is like me and two other
I
people.
know it's also, there's another Washington Post,
Yeah, Ishan. Yeah,
Ishan, right? Super Rangers fan. But yeah, going from being in the Eastern Conference Finals to being one of the worst teams in the league this year, we're not having a good time, Jeff.
it's brutal. A few years ago when the Caps won the Stanley Cup, I managed to sneak some Rangers apparel into the room where it was being showed off to the Washington Post staff. Which didn't really endear me to anyone, as you can
Yeah.
imagine.
Well, I mean, at the very least, your work on this front should, because this, like, how many parts do you have right now to the series? It really is phenomenal.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate that. We've done, I guess, 8 or 9 stories at this point. It's been a year and a half of journalism. I have my notebook on this is now about 1,200 pages of notes. I've interviewed hundreds of people, went to Guatemala. We had a reporter work from Ukraine in the front lines. We had a lawsuit that we filed after a freedom of information request was denied. So we took the government to court. Justice Department lost and was forced to divulge, at least thus far, over 1,300 pages of previously undisclosed records. Talked to basically everyone in sort of the sanction space, people in the government, people outside the government. Humanitarian workers, people in Cuba, people in Venezuela, people in Guatemala and Paraguay. And so the breadth of this thing is remarkable. And it really felt like one of those stories where the more you dig, the sort of deeper the hole gets. And the scale of the impact, the fact that so few people know about it, and sort of the unintended consequences of this key prong of U.S. foreign policy going back 20 years or so has been, just a very rewarding bit of reporting to do, and really excited to discuss it.
So, yeah, it's phenomenal and very well researched. And when I guess we should start at the beginning here about sanctions, how the United States began to deploy them in the manner that they do now. We have this graph that you have in your piece on how much sanctions have proliferated in recent years. And you can see on the screen, if people are watching, the dark red are the numbers of entities that are unsanctioned by our government, and the lighter red represents the number of entities sanctioned. And you can see how since your graph begins in 1995, they have escalated under, Bush and Obama, it was relatively similar, but particularly under Trump and then Biden, sanctions exploded. And now something like 15,000 individuals, businesses, governments are subject of United States sanctions. I guess if you could talk about what sanctions really are, how they are applied, and what accounts for that explosion, just to get us started.
Yeah, no, happy to. So I think a really good big picture frame for people to wrap their heads around this sort of phenomenon is after Iraq and Afghanistan, where Bush obviously was dealt very serious political headwinds from sort of the catastrophes of the wars. There was a move among sort of successive U.S. presidents to not retrench and pull back America's footprint in the world, but to do so in a way that was more politically palatable. And obviously, I'm not trying to suggest that the U.S. has stopped using military force abroad. We all know that that's not true. But what is true is that we have not really seen the kind of large-scale deployments of troops on the ground the way we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. And yet, as I mentioned, US presidents still continue to want to influence affairs abroad. And so economic restrictions, economic penalties have really filled that gap because, as we can discuss, sanctions do not require an act of Congress. The president has almost unchecked unilateral power to impose sanctions on whoever he deems and his administration deems to be a national security threat. They don't cost any money. Like, unlike the military, which you do have to say, hey, Congress, can you approve this budget? Sanctions don't require any new government spending. You just basically, and we can get into the like nerdy mechanics if you're interested, but you just basically say, this person is a threat to the US government. The world financial system cannot deal with them. And this person, this country, this bank, this entity, whatever, this nonprofit, this sector within the country. And so therefore they are basically persona non grata. And I think the motivation behind some of the reporting was to say, on the surface, this seems like a good thing. And maybe in a lot of ways it is, that we're resorting to these kinds of measures much more than the military invasions that Iraq and Afghanistan. But what are the downstream consequences? Let me just quickly read for you something. Here is a partial list of countries that are under some form of US economic sanctions: Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Cuba, Yemen, Afghanistan, Russia, China, Burma, Libya, Sudan, Belarus, Lebanon, Mali, Ethiopia, Paraguay, Zimbabwe, Nicaragua, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Our analysis found that as much as a third of all countries in the world and 60% of all poor countries are under some form of economic sanctions. And so we wanted to understand, how that happened and what the effects are.
And this graph that you also included is also really relevant to that, Bradley. The second graph that I sent you. How you can see how they developed over time, and you rattled off that list of all the countries there, but as the number of sanctions exploded again in the past 10 years or so, you can see how the sanctions that used to be more focused on Central America, and we can talk about how the Cold War and those remnants play into this, but now it's exploded across the rest of the world, specifically in Asia, and you can see that as it relates to Russia and how those sanctions spiked, but Trump was really bullish on sanctioning Iran as well. So when you talk about the political elements of this, the drone war also, I think, fits in with this idea where the political cost of a drone assassinating a bunch of people abroad or killing folks, and Obama increased the drone war and then Trump increased it over Obama. Biden actually cut into that, and he's been more bullish on sanctions, as you can see. But the idea that we want to continue our imperialism abroad, but we don't necessarily want the public to have input in it, and this creates a bit of a shield from our impact. Like, that seems to be a lot of the focus, and you can see how that runs into conflict in terms of like how the American public and many activists have responded to our funding of Israel right now, right? Like, there's a rub there, even though obviously there's all these different kind of mechanisms to prevent the public from having input on our foreign policy.
I think you put your finger on something very perceptive about sort of the geographic shift in the use of sanctions, because to me, what that really reflects is a changing understanding of, as this tool has become more and more heavily used, its deployment has really shifted from really, 20, 30 years ago. Sanctions were primarily a tool used to go after sort of and push around smaller, less powerful, less significant countries. As you mentioned, Latin America, Cuba is obviously sort of the paradigmatic example of sanctions, North Korea, Iran. These are kind of rogue states, if you will, countries that are not sort of strategically significant in geopolitics and the global economy. But as sanctions have become more and more the sort of tool of first and last resort for the US government, we've seen a shift into what we have now, which is presidents using them as their central tool against Russia when they invade Ukraine, against China over threats over the South Pacific Sea, against sort of the major players that the U.S. is trying to deal with. And some people will say, that reflects a lack of imagination, a lack of creativity, an inability to look at diplomacy and other tools and say, this is something that's easy to do. This is something we can impose cost-free. Let's just put them on across the board. And at the maximum, it will hurt someone abroad, and we won't see any reverberations, domestically from it.
And can you elaborate on that point about how it hinders diplomacy? You had a quote from a former official in the Commerce Department in one of the pieces in this series saying, "It is the only thing between diplomacy and war, and as such has become the most important foreign policy tool in the U.S. arsenal, and yet nobody in government is sure this whole strategy is even working." If you could explain how that middle ground there that has now become so dominant prevents the United States from engaging in good faith talks, where it's just another form of us using our massive power. It's like a military invasion would be using the fact that we have the largest military in the world by many times over, but we're also the financial center of the world in many ways, although, of course, China is challenging that. We're using the weight of our economic influence as brute force, but in a different manner, as opposed to diplomacy, talking to people, making deals, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think this gets to a really core part of the reporting, because, you look at those charts, like anyone looks at those charts and is like, what is happening here? Like, what is going on with this, like this vertiginous increase in the application of this tool? And when I was beginning to work on this story, I kind of, as a reporter, like, you get all the critics and you talk to all of them first, then you take them to the government and you say, so, like, what's your response to this issue? And you interview government sources and you say, like, can you defend this trend? And what I was really surprised by, frankly, in the course of my reporting, was senior administration officials would say, like, Jeff, like, you're completely right. Like, this trend, we think, has gotten out of hand, and we think that we are overusing this tool and that it's becoming less effective, which, is like the best thing ever as a reporter, when someone's like, yeah, like, you're right. Like, the person that you expect to be defensive is like, actually, you're right, is a very rewarding moment. But more importantly, I think, like, was revealing for the fact that the government itself, the challenge is that if you're an official in the State Department or the Treasury Department, and someone comes to you and says, there's this corrupt leader in African country X, or in Ukrainians are asking for help, or, like, there are legitimate non-US cause foreign policy crises all over the world. Like, every day something terrible happens somewhere. And it is, I think, genuinely hard for people who, like, grow up with the mindset, like, I'm going to go help people. That's why I'm going to work in the State Department. Right. For them to, like, be barraged by human rights groups and, like, repressed minorities in Africa and all these things, and to say, like, no, like, I'm not going to help you, or maybe I'll just ask politely. I'll try to do the thing diplomatically. So there is this, like, this force that makes this trend really hard for people to resist on the individual level, even if they sort of collectively realize that the system is flawed or broken, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I guess do you mind expanding a little bit on the impact of sanctions on other parts of the world, and how, frankly, I would say that our sanctions regime has been in many ways an effort to create regime change in areas of the world that we want more influence in. I mean, sometimes Venezuela, that's been the case. Iran, obviously, we've been heavily sanctioning them for quite a while. What is that impact on the people in those countries? And does it cause those governments to turn to, say, alternative economic relationships, like, say, with China or with Russia, in a way where it's like, are we going too far and incentivizing a push away from any collaboration with the United States economically, the more and more nations that we sanction?
I think this is the most important question about this whole field. What are the humanitarian consequences? How many innocent people are we hurting with this, with our penalties? We've done a lot of reporting on this. I'll just quickly mention two things. One is we were able to reveal for the first time that DHS, the Department of Homeland Security under Trump, had written confidential government analyses saying that sanctions on Venezuela risked exacerbating the outmigration that we saw. We saw basically the Venezuelan economy imploded at a historic level. We saw Venezuela's economy contract by more than any other country in peacetime, and by many countries at war. Venezuela's economy under heavy sanctions contracted more than Iraq after 2003, after Ukraine during the Russian invasion, more than Zimbabwe when its currency was collapsing. So these are huge, huge impacts. And some research suggests that about half of the Venezuelan economic collapse was caused by U.S. sanctions in particular. And at a time when everyone in U.S. politics was like, what's the deal with all of these people coming across the border? We had ourselves exacerbated that problem with economic penalties that hurt the Venezuelan economy. The other thing I'll just mention quickly on the humanitarian front, some of the sanctions are targeted, by which I mean they only hit specific companies or specific people or specific nonprofits or networks. And one example of that we discovered was that the US sanctioned 2 mining companies in Guatemala. It's something that almost no one had paid any attention to before we wrote about it. And I went down to like Northeast Guatemala. It's one of the poorest places in the world. And these mining companies were not great. Like it's not someone that like you or I would want to work for. They were not like commendable employees by a lot of metrics.
Right.
But the US moved to close them and shut them down, which was successful, plunged this already desperately poor part of the world into true economic misery. I mean, unemployment surged, malnutrition surged. People I talked to on the street were hungry, hadn't eaten. They, in many cases, had tried migrating to the US. Some of them had died migrating to the US after the US closed down their companies. And so like I've seen firsthand what these things can do. And they're very powerful. And it's like incredible because you're in this 6-hour drive from Guatemala City in these like northeast mountain hinterlands, and you're talking to people who are like, what's the deal with the US Treasury sanctions? And it's an incredible thing because you're like, nobody at Treasury knows who you people are. Like it's this incredible asymmetry. Go
on, Jeff.
No, sorry, I'm very long-winded on these things. So
no. It's just important to recognize that impact because, to be honest, the morality of the claims of like who we're sanctioning is a little bit undercut by everything else that we do, right? Like, I mean, the Biden administration has not followed through on sanctions, even of these individual extremist settlers in the West Bank. Like, some of those were retracted. And so when it's selectively deployed with countries that we have an adversarial relationship with, and then we're trying to make these humanitarian cases because of X company being exploitative, I mean, frankly, it's ridiculous that we have no standing to make that case. And so at the end of the day, it's really about punishing people that don't kind of fall in line with the United States.
Yeah. And just on the humanitarian front, just one last thing, the Biden administration, maybe, some people would say to their credit, has gotten much more aggressive about issuing humanitarian licenses, which say, okay, we've sanctioned Syria, but here is a license that says if you are shipping, food or medicine or equipment to rebuild their electrical grid, you have a license that circumvents the sanctions. That they will say that, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is that if you're a bank, if you're a major Wall Street bank, for instance, and you you facilitate a transaction between a Syrian company and a Western company. And it turns out that Syrian company was not actually going to use the thing, the import for what they said they would. And it goes towards, they sell it to a terrorist group or they're actually purchasing something else. That bank is now subject to crippling fines, tens of millions of dollars of fines from the US government. So the banks are saying, like, no, like I'm not going to touch this no matter what your license says. Like I'm not taking that risk. And so it's this, I think, really telling example of the gap between sort of the aspiration of the government to say we're carving out these humanitarian exemptions, and the reality, which is that for humanitarian groups, they still can't get these supplies in because the banks are not willing to facilitate those transactions.
Because of the risk.
Yeah, exactly. It's called de-risking. It's a huge problem, and it some of the humanitarian groups will say, like, it makes a mockery of the pretensions to be doing this in a way that exempts civilian populations. I also liked your other question about sort of like the selective deployment. One of the stories in the series, we spent months looking at sort of these records that the Justice Department has to keep of lobbyists who are working for foreign entities. And what these records showed was a huge increase in lobbying on sanctions. And these guys who work in the Treasury Department and work in DOJ on state on sanctions, like, you would not believe how much money is in this. I mean, I guess it makes sense in a lot of ways, right? Like, if
I wrote this down, that the lobbying on sanctions, you wrote in your piece, sanctions-related lobbying surged just from $6 million in 2014 to $31 million in the last publicly available records in 2022. And that's
that's a huge
less than 20 years.
That's a tiny window into what's actually happening, because a lot of these things don't get recorded as sanctions lobbying.
Exactly.
A lot of the disclosures don't get made at all. There's this kind of, we wrote about this a little bit, but there's this thing that a lot of people consider to be a huge loophole where if you're doing legal defense of a sanctioned party or entity, it does not have to be disclosed. So what's the difference between legal defense and lobbying? Like, if you don't want to disclose it, you can say it's legal defense, and then you don't have to tell the public that you are a former Justice Department official who's now being paid millions of dollars by some, foreign dictator to lobby your buddies and say, hey, can you cut this guy a break? And, oh, by the way, we have an opening next year if you're thinking about retiring. In one case, we found, the exact number is escaping me, but it was something like 70 or 80 million dollars has been paid to one lobbying firm set up by former Treasury officials from the entities linked to the United Arab Emirates, which is, I mean, I don't have to tell you, a lot more than you can make in the government. I'm going to just triple check that number so I don't get sued for mischaracterizing it to you.
Yeah.
Don't be like ABC.
Yeah, right. That's true.
Yeah, exactly.
But as you look it up, it's going to be a high figure, I imagine. And also just we were just talking earlier about how members of Congress should probably get paid more, and that Republicans are using that as a way to just be like, hey, we're populist, but we're actually going to continue to incentivize our lawmakers from getting money from private sources. This is an extension of that here.
Yeah, more than $75 million to one firm.
Oof.
So, I mean, it's probably getting close to what you guys pull in here. Anyway.
The Soros money does keep us well fed. I guess so. Lastly, when we're talking about this sanctions regime here, you also had another part of this story that was, I think, something people may not know about, that when we sanction individual people like this particular Russian billionaire, Viktor Vekselberg, I think that's his name, that we seized his super yacht, which is worth $90 million. But when we do that via sanctions, the taxpayers are paying right now for the upkeep of the super yacht that was seized. If you could just tell people about how that works as it relates to sanctions once we take a step or an action like that against a Russian oligarch billionaire type.
Yeah, in April 2022, right after Ukraine was invaded, President Biden had this big address where he said, look, we're going to go after Russian oligarchs who keep their money in the West, and we are going to take their, quote, ill-begotten gains. And on paper, like many things in the sanctions world, that sounds like something a lot of people can get behind. The reality, though, has been that of the oligarch assets seized through this effort, only $6 million with an M dollars have gone to Ukraine, which is just by comparison, U.S. taxpayers have spent over $170 billion on Ukraine. So this has produced a tiny amount. And furthermore, as you're saying, Emma, actually the story we had today was about another yacht named the Amadea. We actually don't know, the one you brought up, we don't know how much they're spending on that, which is something that, you might think the government would have to disclose to the press after repeated questions, but they have not. But we did sue the government and did get these records over how much they're spending on the Amadea, this other yacht. And they show that we've spent about $30 million. Taxpayers have spent almost $30 million on maintaining this yacht, because even though the oligarch who owns it has been sanctioned, that doesn't give the U.S. permission to just liquidate it right away. You have to get a court order to approve that sale. And there's questions now about whether that yacht was actually owned by that guy or owned by someone else. And so what seemed like a very simple thing to punish allies of Putin has become a sort of significant taxpayer expense. And Elon Musk actually tweeted at me today to ask more about the story. So we'll see if Doge is going to take a look at this.
Well, I have him muted, and honestly, it's made my life a lot better. So, but we'll see. I mean, I have some skepticism about his sincerity about cutting government spending, particularly as it relates to the Department of Defense and the contracts that he receives. That's a whole nother bag.
Well, and they're also looking at, $4 to $6 or $7 trillion of tax cuts. So you put that against a few $1 billion here or there. So, the scale here will be interesting to keep an eye on.
Well, Jeff, really appreciate your time today, and everybody should check out the full series at the Washington Post. I mean, really, just to as an aside, the fact that there had been some people who unsubscribed based on the fact that the editorial board reversed its decision on the Harris endorsement. I just wanted to say, and I still think that the Washington Post, you guys have so many really good journalists there that are doing phenomenal work, and I still subscribe and want to support your journalism, and I think people should too. So thanks so much, Jeff. Yeah, no, really appreciate it. We don't need more journalists punished by billionaires and their decisions. So thanks so much, Jeff.
No comment, but yeah, thanks. Bye, Emma.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.